talking about character. Um, the first and maybe the most important thing to know about character development is that your characters need to seem to the reader to be living, breathing people, not some character in a novel, someone like someone they know or someone they heard about or someone they met once, someone they can relate to. Now, the question is, how do you do that? How do you create living, breathing characters? Among other things, well, let's start with the basics. You give them a goal or goals. They want something, and whatever they want is likely really important to your story, perhaps even the plot of your story. Those two things go together, but right now we're not talking about plot, we're talking about character. Um, so that whatever they want is likely critical to your story. They have a skill set that's good at that, or they develop one so they can get what they want. Um, for those of you who know the reference, Jack Reacher is really good at solving other people's problems. He's detached, he doesn't get involved himself. He's a mountain of a man who has great skills, so he's good in a fight. So most of his stories, most of the stories about him are going to feature those things. Those either that skill set and the skills he needs or acquires or makes use of to further the goal of whatever the story is. And for any story, whether it's a story like a Reacher story or not, those things stay the same. How is your character involved in your story? Um, so, what else about them that makes them living, breathing human people? One of the most important things is they are flawed. They make mistakes, they guess wrong, they have their own problems that get in the way of whatever it is they're supposed to be doing. They aren't perfect. Perfect people are boring. Perfect people have no worries. Perfect people are always going to solve the day because they're perfect. Where's the story in that? Um, Even Superman, who's about as close to perfect of a physical specimen as we can imagine, even Superman has kryptonite. He has something that can bring him down. Because if he were perfect, there would be no tension, there would be no drama. The story would be over before it started. Um, by the way, the one of the TV shows I worked on was Star Trek Voyager, and the first show I pitched to them, if you don't know, very briefly, the plot of the entire series of Star Trek Voyager is this ship full of Star Trek people has been flung to the far side of the galaxy, and they spend the whole series trying to get home. And I pitched that we find a society that can send us home, but they won't. And the first thing back from one of the creators of the show was, no, we're not going to do that. Because if you say I can get you all the way home, everybody knows that's not going to happen. Because if that happens, the series is over. Tell, make it that we have we've ran into a society that can send us halfway across the galaxy, halfway home. We'd still have 40 years at best to get the rest of the way. That's another example of perfect is not good. um, so, in order to create living, breathing characters, you the writer need to get to know them. You have to know what they want, what they need, what they're trying to achieve, and then you put that into your story. Tell your story, and we're going to talk about how to do that in just a second. But when you do this, when you know your characters, you are telling your story based on what they want, not what you want. You, the writer, know where the plot is going, but you need to be careful about looking like you are manipulating your characters to get what you want. When you come from what they desire most, what they are trying hardest to find or to hide or to make right or whatever it is, when you think from their point of view, you will tell a better story. You will tell a more believable story because we, the reader, will be invested in those characters and what they want, not what you, the writer, want, although you're still obviously the puppet master. So, how do you do that? Um, you don't have Mr. Bad Guy do whatever he does, so Miss Goody Two Shoes is in peril to make your story work. You give him a reason for what he wants, and you give her a reason for what she's trying to get, and you basically let your characters fight it out. And the best way to know everything you need to know about your characters in order to do this, in order to create these living, breathing characters, is to create a biography, what we call a bio, for each character. Um, Judy Blume has what I think is maybe a little long of a list of questions you should ask about each of your main characters. And she suggests even your minor characters. But if you don't know, by the way, Judy Blume is one of the most prolific children's writers extant. And she's a marvel and a love. Um, I'm going to share with you Judy's list, and you'll get the idea. Um, Here it is. Okay, what's your character's name? What is their gender at the moment? I thought that was nice of Judy to add that. When is their birthday and why this is important? What is their age at the beginning of your novel? Especially for a children's writer, of course, that's important. But I think that's important for each of us. Now, I'm going to say right now, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this. It's not that you need to get every single one of the answers to this question into your novel. Maybe not. We may never know how old your character is, but you need to know. When you know your characters well, you will write them better, even if you don't reveal half of the stuff on this list. But continuing with the list, what do they look like? What is their general disposition? Are they frowny? Are they smiling? Where do they live? What do they eat? How do they dress? Do they dress to impress? Do they dress in a way that is appropriate for their age, or do they dress to look younger or older than they are? What major experiences have they had in their lives? Have they had any traumatic experiences? Did they have a bad childhood? Or did they have a good childhood suddenly destroyed by a traumatic event? Notice the drama even in that question that Judy's asking. What dramatic thing has happened to your character that made them who they are? What are their ruminations? Do they have any obsessions? Are they in love? Do they have any pets? Do they have any medical conditions? What do they like to do in their spare time? Do they have any spare time? What are their friends like? What are their hobbies? What are they most embarrassed by? Where do they go on their first date and with whom? You get the idea. When you know that about your characters, then you have a good idea. And you can make your own list. You can add or subtract from Ms. Bloom's list. But when you ask those kind of questions about your characters, you're going to get to know them. You're going to know the way they would react to something someone says or something someone does without having to stop and think about it a great deal, because they are going to be living, breathing people to you. You can and should make your own list. I think this list is pretty good. By the way, in the business, a lot of we call this a Bible, where all your characters are, where you want your plot to go, all the information that is behind the story you're telling is all in one place where you can refer to it and make your characters consistent, make your plot consistent, make your story consistent, or your series if you're writing one consistent. You can keep a Bible of all of this that you can refer back to if you forget what it was you said this character liked or didn't like. By the way, what your bio, your Bible, whatever you call it, is likely to change as you work. It's likely to grow as you work. You don't need to sit down and do all of this before you start. You should do some of it. You should have a sense of who these people are. But often your characters are going to surprise you. They're going to be grumpy about Aunt Mary, or they are going to grow to you. And as they do, you can add to your bio. You can add to your Bible. You can add to what you know about who likes who for whatever reason, or etc. You should also you should absolutely create a bio for your major characters. Think about doing one. It doesn't have to be as long for your minor characters, because every character in your story should be, even if they make a small appearance, some living, breathing person, some person that you recognize. They're grumpy, they're gullible, they're happy to do whatever they're asked. You get a sense of each of these characters you're putting in your story as you go along. Okay. Details are important, and you want to show. I kind of said this already. You want to showcase those traits, but you don't have to tell us everything about your characters, and you especially don't have to tell us everything all at once. There should be two parts to your bio. the backstory. What's their birthday? Do they have a dog? Blah, 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 blah. And those traits. They are happy go lucky. They are taciturn. They are always suspicious of everybody. They are always assume everybody's a good person. Those two are slightly different, but together they create this picture of this person that you want. Gary, I think we might have some interference on the line.
If everyone except for Greg could mute their mic, please. Carol, I think that might be you.
Moving on. Okay, so when you know these traits and when you know their past and what they want for the future and what they're afraid of, these characters will be easier to write. Um, okay, and we already talked about backstory and traits. Um, Now, once you know your characters, what they like, who they hate, who they'll never get over, as I said earlier, now you can see how you let those traits, those choices, those prejudices, you can let that drive your story. Um, because again, what they want or what they're trying to hide or what they're trying to discover is the plot of your story often. That's how character and plot go together. Um, yes, it's still your story, but when it comes out as what your characters want, um, again, your reader will identify even more with these characters. What is so important to them. Now, um, what's their driving goal? And is that also, and it often is, but doesn't have to be, the arc of the plot of your story? How do they grow as they work to attain that goal? How do they change? What impact does the story and the events in the story, what impact does that have on your main character or characters? Um, what might they lose? What might they have to give up to get what they want? What might they sacrifice? Again, these characters are going to change as your story goes on. And the greater the sacrifice, the greater the goal, the greater the desire, the more passion, for lack of a better word, there will be in your story. And perhaps the more interest. Um, Now, one thing that is important, keep your characters true to themselves. Once you know who they are, don't let them do things that are out of character because that's where you need the plot to go. Because your readers, will spot that in a heartbeat. Oh, he wouldn't really do that. He's just doing that so the plot goes this way. You don't want anybody to say that as they're reading your story. You want them to believe that this character is doing whatever he or she is doing because of what they want, because of what they need. Um, and they are going to change. I'll give you a quick example. Young Johnny has never told a lie. That does not mean in the course of your story he's not going to lie, but that means that lie is going to affect him. Does he feel terrible? He's done this thing he was told by his mother never to do, or does he feel the opposite? I lied. I got away with it. The sky didn't fall. It's your choice as the writer. But when your characters change, when they succumb to pressure, as little Johnny apparently did, whatever it is, how does the change affect them? And to a greater extent, how does it affect the story you're telling? Because they are the story you're telling. Okay. Um, Now, how do you fill out the lives of your living, breathing characters? Beyond their flaws, you can look for other things or add to that list of flaws. What are their blind spots? Where are they too stubborn? Where are they too hasty? Where are they too doubtful of what they already know? Where do they guess wrong? And how are their lives affected by their family, their children, their siblings, their parents, their coworkers? It has been said, by the way, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, but it's been said that the goal of your supporting characters is not to help your main characters, it's to get in their way. the the family that wants him to do something else, the mother that wants him to get a new job. Not always, of course, and you need your heroes and heroines will need some support to get them to where they need to be, but they need to be carrying the heavyweight. Your leads need to be driving your story. They can get a little bit of help from the supporting cast, but often that supporting cast is intentionally or not um, in their way more than one helpful. It creates another thing for your heroes and heroines to solve, to get over, to get around, to get past. Um, okay. Now, where do we see these traits, this gullibility or this um, suspicion? Where do we see the traits that you've given your characters show up in your story? Show them to us. Imbue your characters with what makes them human so that we believe in them. You don't need to overdo this. But once, and you certainly don't need to use every character trait you've decided your character has. But where are those traits influencing how your character does what they do? Um, what you, one of the things you don't want to do, there are examples all through. Let me start over. I suggest that you not tell us all about your character when you introduce him or her. It's called, the pejorative term is called an info dump. There are, in classic literature, lots of cases. Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde leaps to mind. We meet that lawyer before we meet Jekyll or Hyde, and we know more about him than I care to know before we know what the story is. That's, you might call that an info dump. Better when you introduce your characters and your story to let them unfold. We learn how they dress here. We learn how they speak over there. We learn that they like puns over here. There are almost little reveals, little surprises as you go along, as your character, as what we know about your character deepens, and that has the advantage of not slowing your story down, as in the case of Mr. Stevens's story, to describe this character to us before we even know what the story is. Keep your story moving. Reveal these character traits a little at a time. There'll be little surprises, little Easter eggs along the way. Um, Often, by the way, those things may be a surprise. Oh my gosh, she likes puns. Oh my gosh, he tells dad jokes. Now, that. But if we stop to think about that character, it should fit. Yeah, that fits with everything else I know about him. He probably is the kind of guy who would tell dad jokes. Okay. um, Now you can start to think of your characters as a team. How do they work together? How do they live together? How do they sleep together? Make them fully rounded, and part of that is make them not always, as most is true of most teams, not always all together on the same page. But all they can all be working for the same thing. They might just all believe that the way to get there is slightly different, or they might not be working for the same thing. That's for you to figure out. But they are a team, not again, even if they're not in sync. Um, and the characters that we do know less about, you still want to know enough to know again how they would talk, how they would react to a certain thing. Probably if you build a bio for them, we will know even less of that bio, but you will know it. You will know even those who those small characters are and how they would react. And again, that's going to make a more well-rounded story. Um, okay, let's talk for a bit about real people. Um, there is a thing you've probably all heard: write what you know. That can be true in a literal way. You grew up on a dairy farm. You're writing about a murder that takes place in a dairy farm. There's a whole lot of research about dairy farms you don't have to do because you know how those cows are when they get milked. You know what it is to get them into the barn and when to get them back out and when the milk goes bad and when the inspector comes along. You know all that. But more to the point, write what you know for all of us is emotional because emotions are universal. Somebody once said, write a story for everybody and try to write a story for everybody and you are likely to fail. Write a story that's personal to you, and you are likely to get a response from everybody because the emotions we feel are in some ways universal. I'll tell you a quick story. Ellen Sandler, who wrote among other shows, Everybody Loves Raymond. Ellen and I crossed paths a couple of different times at UCLA and elsewhere. And she tells a story of when Ellen was a little girl. Her father was a jeweler, and they grew up in New York City, and their apartment was above the jewelry store. So the jewelry store was on the first floor, apartments on the second floor. Ellen won an award for her art at school, and she was so excited. And she came home and she showed it to her dad. Dad, look, I won this award. She was 11 years old. And he said, "That's great, honey. You're an artist. Hey, I have an idea. How would you like to design the look of the window of the jewelry store, where the watches go, where the rings go, where the bracelets go?" She loved the idea. She sat down and did several sketches. She applied what she'd learned in art class about how your eye goes from one thing to the next, and you can kind of then have something that catches your eye and goes down here and over there. She spent the afternoon on it. While she was working, a friend of her dad's came over, and because the apartment was upstairs, they went upstairs for a drink. Apparently, this is what a jeweler in New York City at the time did if business was slow. So she finishes the one she thinks is the best, and she starts putting the watches here and the rings there and the bracelets there and the necklaces here because that would be the best place. And after the drink, her dad and a friend are walking down the stairs, and her dad says to the friend, either not knowing or not caring that Ellen could overhear him, "Ellen's doing my window. I saved $75 getting her to do it." And she was devastated. Her dad wasn't interested in her art. He was interested in saving money. Okay, flash forward decades. Ellen's working on Everybody Loves Raymond. And briefly, if you know the show, Ray is a sports writer. His dad is a curmudgeon who used to be Frankenstein, and Frankenstein's monster. And his dad never pays any attention to Ray's work. You can probably see where this is going. Suddenly, Dad takes an interest. "Show me that article you're writing about that first baseman. He got caught in a bar with somebody who wasn't his wife. Yeah, that's going to be in tomorrow's paper. Show me that." And Ray gets so excited because his dad is suddenly interested in what he does for a living. He tells his wife how excited he is. This is going to change the relationship with him and his dad. And then he discovers that Dad, having that information one day before everybody else, is placing bets on whether that team is going to win or lose. You can see the connection, the emotional connection. Ray is not an 11-year-old. He's a grown man with a wife and a family and a job. He still is devastated. He thought his dad has an interest in him. Where are the emotional turmoils in your own life that you can apply to your characters? Nobody who doesn't know that story would ever know that little Ellen at 11 years old had her heart broken by her dad. By the way, that episode was called You Bet. It was nominated for an Emmy that year. The Academy said this is one of the 5 best scripts written this year. So Ellen put her heart into it. She put her emotions into it. And even though the story is completely different, the emotions carried the day and made that an award-worthy story. Write from your heart. Write fearlessly. Do not worry about what your mom might think. Do not worry, was somebody going to figure out that this is the way you really felt when your dog died? None of that matters. Take the emotions that you know and be fearless in giving them to your characters. And you will break our hearts. And when you do, we'll buy your next book. Okay. By the way, another way to show us your characters is through actions. Your characters walk across rooms all the time. How? Do they trudge? Do they waltz? Do they dance? Do they march? Do they stomp? You don't want to do this every single time somebody's walking across the room, but you can take little actions that also show us your characters. How they walk across a room, there's a famous scene, how this woman folds napkins at the dinner table. Oh my God, you would never cross this woman if you saw the way she folded napkins at the dinner table. Little actions can also show us your characters. Um, Again, show don't tell. You've all heard it before. It applies in everybody's writing, everywhere. Instead of Larry leaves angry, that's telling us two things: that he's leaving and that he's angry. Larry stomps across the room, marches out the door, and slams it so hard the windows rattle. That's a man who's angry. That's showing us that he's angry without using the word leave or angry. You get the idea. Show us. Keep your characters alive in your story, especially those smaller characters, those supporting characters. If they're there at the beginning of the story and they're going to be important at the end of the story, bring them back in the middle somewhere. Keep them alive. So, because the last thing you want is your reader in the third chapter from the end going, wait, who's Barbara again? Keep your characters alive. Keep your plots alive too, but we're not talking about plot today. So, keep your characters alive in your story. And in general, don't temper your characters' emotions. There are exceptions to every single thing I've ever said about writing, and there are exceptions to this rule. But the rule, the guideline, we don't call them rules, we call them guidelines. The guideline is don't temper emotions. John was rather amused. Jill was somewhat miffed. Why? Why rather? Why somewhat? If you're, if you're writing in the 1800s, that's the way we wrote all the time. But one of my favorites, he was not unamused. I mean, that's charming, right? But we could be a little more direct. John was amused. Sally was miffed. And probably there's a better verb than was, but we're not talking about that today either. Okay. Show us your reactions, your characters' reactions to the things happening to them. Your reader is living vicariously through your main characters. When your characters are happy or afraid or feeling triumphant, show us, because your reader will likely feel the same thing. We are, I believe, in one of the classes that follows this class, we will talk more about emotion and how to write emotion and when to write emotion and when to let the reader assume what the emotion is. But in general, because that's a thing for another day, make sure that your reader understands the emotions of your main characters, because they are living vicariously through them as they read your story. How do your characters dress? What does this tell them about them? This is back to Judy Blume's list. Do they exercise? Do they love being in the woods? Do they love curling up with a good book? Show us who they are. And this is, again, how you make living, breathing characters. Okay. Now, once you've done all that, make sure your characters care deeply about whatever they're involved in. If they do, as we were saying just a minute ago, because your reader is living vicariously through them, your reader will also care deeply. If your characters don't, your reader won't. What's important? What's vital to your story? What is vital to your characters in your story will keep the reader on the edge of their seat. If your character isn't deeply involved, your reader won't be either. When I was a boy, I read the Tarzan books, as many, many boys did. I don't remember which book it was, but I remember in the opening of one book, Tarzan is in the jungle, resting under a tree, and he hears a scream. And he thinks, well, I'll check that out, maybe tomorrow. And even as a boy, I don't remember how old, 8, 9, 10, I thought, no, you're Tarzan. You have to get up and go see what that is. Why aren't you going up and seeing what that is? That is the reaction, that 8-year-old reaction, is the reaction you want to avoid from all. Your characters care deeply about what they're doing and strive mightily despite all of their hang-ups and all of their how they get in their own way and etc etc etc, to do whatever it is. And if they do, your reader will not want to put the book down. When Tarzan says, "Man, maybe I'll go look tomorrow," I'm tempted to put the book down. Okay. Let's talk about tension. Tension can be a lot of things. An avalanche coming at your characters creates tension. But the most common kind of tension is when your characters want different things. So, know what your characters want. Back to that bio. You have, in a novel, you have chapters. And within that chapter, if you think about it this way, you have scenes. Let's say if you're in the house, that's a scene. If you get out and driving in a car, that's a scene. You get to your work and you talk to your coworkers, that's a scene. Those could all be within one chapter. Within each scene, you should know what your character wants. What your characters want, because you have more than one. And you should let them act accordingly. And then let that drive your story. So, this is a good exercise on a day when, if you have days like this, and I've had a few myself, you're sitting in front of your work and the work for the next chapter just isn't flowing. Stop and go back and read through, kind of skim through the chapters you've already written and ask yourself, in this scene, when he walks in his office, what does my character want? And here's what you should notice. Because you can kind of skim through very quickly, you should know immediately what your character wants. The ones you want to pay attention to are the scenes when you go, oh, well, I need him to be in the office because I need him to get that phone call, but I'm not sure what he wants here. Those are the ones you want to pay attention to, because tension is created when your characters want different things. Also with avalanches and etc. But right now we're talking about character and tension. Tension is when your characters want different things. So knowing what they want and knowing which characters in each scene want something different will allow you. We write, this is part of what we chatted about the last time we got together. I believe we are all pretty instinctive writers. Since we were sitting around caves in fireplaces, we were telling each other stories. And we are native-born storytellers. We are. But there are ways, there are skills you can develop to make your storytelling sharper. When you know what the tension is between your characters, you can work to sharpen that. We'll talk about that in a minute. You can work to raise the stakes, to make things more important. And you want to continue to do that through your novel. You want there to be not great lapses where there's not a great deal of tension. There is a description of a beautiful day and everybody's having a picnic and everybody's having a good time. Every once in a while, sure, that's fine, but what story are we following? Without tension, there is no drama. Without drama, there is no story. Maybe we'll talk about a couple of exceptions to that, but there aren't many. So, that day that you're kind of reviewing through, just check and make sure you know in each scene what your characters want. Let's take an example of how you can know that and then exploit it. How do you choose to exploit it? Let's take a tried and true, well-worn example. Wife is home, she's doing the laundry, she picks up hubby's shirt and says, "Is that lipstick on his collar?" Now, what does she do with that information? Is hubby home? Can she go confront him right away? Is he at work? Is he on a business trip? Wouldn't that make things worse? How long does that tension fester before she gets to ask the question? Now, let's take a couple of examples of how she might respond. She walks in to hubby's man cave. She holds up the shirt and says, "How did you get lipstick on your collar?" Now, the trick with tension is not to resolve it too soon. "Oh, I ran into Aunt Alice. You know the way Aunt Alice is. Oh my God, call her. She'll tell you." The tension is resolved, right? Unless she calls Aunt Alice and Alice says, "I haven't seen your husband in days." That would be good. But other ways. And by the way, in the movies you watch, I'm gonna give you a writer's tip that maybe won't make this is not the way fans think. This is the way writers think. But in the movies you watch, in the TV you watch, in the novels you read, notice how often when wife says, "How come there's lipstick on your collar?" The phone rings, the baby throws up, somebody pounds on the door, something breaks that tension. That tension is not resolved, that tension is broken. And when the tension is broken, the tension festers. So you have a chance for him to say, the phone rings, "Oh, honey, it's work, it's an emergency, I gotta go, we'll talk about this later." Boom, that tension is not resolved. Wife is still standing there holding a shirt with lipstick on it. Is it somebody in the office? Was that his mistress who just called? Are they meeting back at the office? You can see where this could go, and that tension escalates. Find the tension, poke it. Look to make it fester, look to make it grow. And most of the time, that will work well for your story. Again, there's exceptions to everything, but most of the time, that will make your story. That will keep us involved in your story. So don't necessarily be in a hurry to resolve these issues. Let them fester. Let them work. Hubby gives her an answer that she doesn't believe. Does she hire a PI? Does she follow him to work? Does she wonder why he's working so many hours late? You again, we can get off wife and hubby, but you can see where all of this could go. And in the plot of your story, that could continue for as long as you want it to before it's resolved one way or the other. Also, what do we know about these characters? Do we, your reader, believe that what we know about that husband, he would never ever stray? And we want it to be resolved in his favor. Maybe. But again, that's if that's true, that's your reader saying, please don't let that be true. I want to like this guy. I don't want him to be a philanderer. Please let it be Aunt Molly and she's all slobbery. Yeah. Okay. Um, okay. Now, again, we just talked about this. How does the tension compare with what we know about the character we just talked about? And the more you know about your characters, the easier these questions are to answer. Would he really have strayed? Is somebody setting him up? Did somebody put lipstick on his collar to try to mess up his marriage? Maybe it's some guy at work. Who knows? Anyway, as you approach the climax of your story, those festering tensions, again, this is not universal, but those festering tensions, that's when they explode. That's when it comes out what really happened. That's when it comes out that it was John at work who wants Bill's, the husband's job, who put the lipstick there because he knows Susan is jealous. And everything explodes, and John and Bill are in punching each other, or whatever it is that is the climax of your story. You can let some of those tensions fester until then. And they just, along with whatever your main plot is, they explode, they get resolved. Your story goes on. Okay. So where are those tensions that you can let fester? Where are those places that you can raise the stakes? Where can you make your reader wonder what's really going on? Those are all good. Now, and as we said a minute ago, a story that has no tension is boring. A story that is constant tension is too much in the other direction. It's too stressful. The reader never relaxes. And it's actually true that when you have those quiet moments, when you have that picnic that's ideal, the respite makes the tension when you get back to it even stronger. So don't be afraid to get away from the tension from time to time, but come back to it. One of the notes I got back on a pilot I wrote that CBS was considering. It was set in Seattle, a city I love, a city I lived in for a while. And the note back from Dragon Lady, I shouldn't call her that. Anyway, the note back was too much beautiful scenery. And she had a point. Anyway, you get the idea. Okay, let's talk about conflict. We've talked about character, we've talked about tension, let's talk about conflict. It's been said the original, my apologies, by the way, for the sexism in the original, but the original was there are three kinds of conflict, and only three kinds of conflict: man versus man, man versus nature, man versus himself. Later pundits have decided that there should be a couple of additions to that, and the later pundits were a little more gender neutral, and their list included character versus society, character versus the supernatural, character versus technology. Now, there are people who argue that that's the same thing as that original three. And there are people that argue that it's a list of six. But you can see that's not a very long list. Either way, that's not a very long list. um, so, where does your story fit in? Are you thinking in these terms? Where is your story one character versus another? Where is your story one character versus nature? Where is your story your characters versus him or herself? Um, you can obviously play with all three of them. You can play with one of them. You in the story you are instinctively telling in your novel. You have probably done one or more of these. What I'm suggesting now is you notice, because again, like that letting tension fester thing, you can. This is a skill you can hone and make better use of. So once you notice, how do you sharpen these things? How do you increase their impact? How do you make them drive your story closer to the edge? Let's take a look at each one separately. Man versus man, or obviously character versus character. This could be a war story. It could be a love story. The rivals could be two women in love with the same man. They could even be good friends. Conflict isn't relegated only to the battles. There is conflict in every story you're telling, but you decide where there is tension. These characters want different things. There is conflict. And how does that conflict play out? Um, there is almost, again, tension is drama. There is almost no, even in children's stories, even in stories Judy Blume tells, there is tension. The only exception to that I am aware of are stories designed to put children to sleep. Goodnight Moon leaps to mind. Goodnight Room, Goodnight Bunny, Goodnight Shoes, Goodnight. It's just a list of things to say goodnight to until the kid falls asleep. There is no tension in that story. It's a wonderful story. But you get the idea. With the exception of stories designed to put you to sleep, which is not what we want for our audience, you want to keep tension, you want to keep conflict in your story. So, um, your story might be plot driven, it might be character driven. Hopefully, it has some of both. But whatever your story is, it has characters wanting different things, as we've already talked about. So, when we see your characters take on the conflicts of your story, we learn more about them. This is one way we learn about your characters. How do they step up to, just to drag her back one more time, how does that wife step up to that challenge? What if she does find out it's an affair? What does that do to her marriage, her family, her kids, her sense of self? How does she weather that storm? That's a story. That could be your story. That finding lipstick on a collar could be chapter 3, after we've learned what a happy, wonderful family they are and how everybody loves them and thinks they're the happiest people in the world. Okay. So, how do your characters handle the conflict that comes up between them, or as it is, we're talking about character versus character now. So between them. Now, your good guys and your good gals are your protagonists. The characters we root for, the ones we hope will succeed. Anyone working against them is your antagonist. Now, quick note, they don't have to be villains. They simply want something different from what your main characters want. The best characters, the best villains, the best, let's not call them that. The best antagonists believe in what they're doing. Believe that they are right. They're not evil people in most stories. They simply are against your characters, against your main characters. Um, um, let's take a love story as an example. Your two main characters are a man and a woman who have known each other since kindergarten, and the problem is they are both in love with the same woman. That's tension, that's conflict, that's character. Um, and you can add your antagonist. You've got these three characters involved in this love triangle. You can add the antagonist as an example of an antagonist who is not a villain. Could be the mother of our heroine, who believes that a woman loving another woman is wrong. She's not a villain. She doesn't think of herself as one. She only has to believe passionately that the best thing for everyone is for her daughter's best male friend to marry that other girl so her daughter can get on with her life and find a good man. That belief, that drive, you back to knowing what your characters want. Mom wants that. Mom believes that practically anything she does to achieve that is a good thing, right? She's not a villain, at least not in her own mind. She's simply working against our heroine, who happens to be in love with the same woman her best friend is. Okay, now, as I said earlier, the best antagonists are those who believe passionately in what they're doing, like that mom. Um, that mom probably firmly believes that when all is settled and when her daughter is married to a good man, she will see that mom was right all along. Right? Okay. So, oh, by the way, um, in one of the screenplays I wrote, uh, my antagonist, we won't say villain, my antagonist worked for the Department of Defense in biological warfare. And he worked on the most deadly virus ever created, because this one is man made, and the antidote for it. And he believes the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and that the best thing for everybody is to reduce the population of the world by 90%. Then the world itself and the rest of us might survive. Now, is he a villain? He passionately believes in what he's doing. He believes so passionately, he gives the antidote to enough people to keep the world alive. He doesn't give it to himself. Is he a villain? He is working against our heroes, though, in a way that makes us wonder how our heroes are ever going to succeed. Okay, let's look at people versus nature. Um, Maybe your main character is a woman fighting to hold on to her small farm after her husband dies. At least part of her struggle is with nature: storms, floods, drought, being isolated in a small mountain village by heavy snow. Um, you get the idea. Struggling to keep that farm alive while the richer farmers who are also suitors are coming to see her and blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. That's her versus nature, at least on one side of the issue. You could have two lovers on opposite sides of the earth. That's them versus nature, because how do they possibly get back together? Um, and in either of those cases, what do we learn about your characters? How strong is that woman when she stands up and keeps her kids fed and keeps the farm going and keeps the suitors at bay? A little bit like Penelope, you get the idea. Now, you also have people versus themselves. And I'm guessing this one likely needs little explanation, because we talked about flawed characters already. Your hero might fight against a fear of heights, a fear of flying, a desire to steal things. Um, they could fight their own attraction to somebody already in a relationship, to someone of the same sex, to someone whom everyone knows and says is bad for them. They're in love with this person. Everybody says he or she is so bad for you. Okay, this is those people fighting themselves. These are those characters fighting themselves. Um, they need to realize that the ideals they held no longer apply. They need to change. They either need to change and grow, or you're writing a tragedy. They are not going to change and grow, and they're going to end up being miserable. That's one way to tell a story. Um, but you get the idea. People versus themselves. Um, your story will likely carry more than one of those three, maybe all of them. Just notice. Notice where you're telling, oh, this is man versus man. I'm sorry, this is character versus character. This is character versus nature. This is character versus themselves. And where can you tweak that a bit? Where can you raise the stakes? Where can you make that a bigger challenge for your characters to get over? Okay. To conclude, know who your characters are. Write that bio. Know them. Again, you don't need to sit it down and do it all at once, but as your story moves on, uh, keep building that Bible. Um, know what they want and how that is going to impact your story. Again, on both sides of the issue. Who wants to find out? Who wants to hide? Who wants to kept hidden? Who's afraid that if this ever gets out, you get the idea. Um, when you create tension among your characters, don't be in a hurry to resolve that tension. Let it fester, let it swell, let it grow, let it make things worse. What's the relationship between that wife and that husband before that lipstick issue gets resolved?